So a very warm welcome everybody to Voices of Sustainability. This is episode 11, hosted by the Zayed Sustainability Prize. And today we are in uncharted waters, reversing a crisis. These fireside chats are set up, of course, to develop thought leadership around sustainability. Today, it's more of a waterside chat, the transition to an inclusive and prosperous future on today, World Water Day. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Jonathan Foley, the Executive Director of Project Drawdown, as well as Chris Hines, co-founder and the former director of Surfers Against Sewage. My name is Andrew Walker, and it's my delight to be leading us through this waterside chat, as we might want to call it. We have a number of questions, and the format is really one of dialogue with the two guests I have with me today. Many questions have come through the social media channels from those who follow the Zayed Sustainability Prize. So thank you very much for submitting them, and we'll get to those in just a second. The Zayed Sustainability Prize was established in 2008, and it is the UAE's pioneering global award for recognizing organizations and global high schools for sustainable, innovative, and humanitarian solutions. Today, the prize counts 14 years of global impact, with 370 million people around the world benefiting from its winners' solutions across the categories of health, food, energy, water, and global high schools. As I mentioned, today is World Water Day, and the theme of World Water Day in 2022 is all around groundwater, a very major source of the world's water supply alongside natural reserves of rivers and lakes. And yet, social and economic stresses and also climate change are causing water scarcity on the one side and overabundance on the other side. In certain cases, water, of course, touches our lives in every single way. It's intrinsically linked to our health, our food supplies, to our energy, to our industry. And the water challenge is quite significant. Some call it a crisis. And how can we turn this situation around is what we're going to be discussing in just a moment. Matt Damon, who is an advocate for water around the world, says that, well, we're very fortunate because we can be the ones to solve this water challenge. And I think in that spirit, we're going to be discussing in just a moment. And the good news is that we can solve it. Few perhaps would have believed that the energy transition and what we've seen happen around renewable energy could have been ramped up so rapidly with significant transformation. So if we can do it with energy, we can do it with water. A brief introduction to my guests today. Chris Hines MBE is the founder of A Grain of Sand, dedicated to delivering positive change. And between 1990 and 2000, he served as co-founder and director of Surfers Against Sewage, a marine conservation charity working with communities to protect oceans, the waves, beaches, and marine life. Chris was then sustainability director at the Eden Project in Cornwall in England for 5 years. And since the year 2000, he has continued to support sustainability initiatives of all shapes and sizes. Dr. Jonathan Foley is Executive Director at Project Drawdown and a world-renowned environmental scientist, sustainability expert, an author, and a public speaker. His work is focused on understanding our changing planet and finding new solutions to sustain the climate, ecosystems, and natural resources that we all depend upon. Jonathan's groundbreaking research has made major contributions to our understanding of global ecosystems, of food security, and environment and climate change. and the sustainability of the world's resources, not least water. So warm welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us here on World Water Day.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Jonathan, let's get stuck straight in. You're one of the world's most cited researchers when it comes to environmental science, and the focus of that research and your current work is largely on climate solutions. With climate change, the situation with water scarcity is also exacerbated. And I mentioned before, in some cases, it leads as well to overabundance. So what do you think are the key factors contributing to this global water crisis, to this challenge we are facing?
Well, the first order, the water crises we see around the world, and as you say, there's scarcity, abundance, and everything in between happening all at the same time wherever you are. But the first order, the water crisis we see around the world is still primarily driven by human consumption. We are using an enormous amount of water, and in some regions, far more than nature can replenish. Where I live in the United States, we see this in the Colorado River. It barely even gets into the ocean most years because we've overconsumed an entire watershed, or the Aguelo Aquifer, or the Aral Sea in Central Asia. Time and time again, we see water resources that are just over-extracted compared to what nature can replenish. And that was happening before climate change was becoming more obvious around the planet. And most of that use of water, of course, is in agriculture. About 70% of water withdrawals globally are for irrigation. It's 85% of what we call consumptive use, water that's taken out of a watershed and doesn't flow back into it later. And then after that, of course, is industry. The second biggest user of water are primarily the energy industry. Power plants and other things are quite thirsty, use a lot of water. And then finally is domestic consumption, all the people in the world and our homes and our, for cleaning and drinking and all that kind of thing. And that, of course, is perhaps the most important use of water for many folks. So we have water consumption is really still the elephant in the room. But now, not just at the margins, but pretty seriously, patterns of climate are beginning to get destabilized as the world warms more and more. And so we often hear a lot about more extreme and persistent droughts and more extreme and persistent flood events. I don't think you can go to many places in the world without hearing, wow, we've had a couple of 100-year floods recently. Isn't that supposed to happen once every 100 years? But it seems to be happening a lot more often than that. Similarly with droughts and so on. And that's not just anecdotal. It's not just our foggy memories of the past. The data clearly bear this out, that persistent patterns of extreme events are happening more and more frequently around the world, nearly in every geography. So this is kind of a train wreck of over-consuming water in the first place. And then the supply of water from the climate system is becoming more and more flaky. It's becoming more erratic. That's not a recipe for success. So we have to think about both angles. One is how we use and consume water, of course, probably most directly. But then secondly, what can we do to stop climate change from getting much worse, which will further exacerbate, maybe even in exponential ways, what we have as water crises around the world.
And tell us a bit about Project Drawdown and what are some of the climate solutions that you've identified to alleviate this stress of climate change, especially when it comes to the water resources and the water ecosystems?
Yeah, well, Project Drawdown, or drawdown.org, if you'd like to visit us on the web, is an organization devoted to finding and disseminating climate solutions. We're working to find the moment in history where we can stop increasing the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which further warm and destabilize our planet, to getting to the point where they stabilize and maybe even begin to come down again. That's the moment of drawdown. To do that, we first and foremost have to stop the sources of pollution. We have to stop sources of pollution in basically 5 major areas. Producing electricity from coal and natural gas is number 1. Second would be the emissions of greenhouse gases from the food system, largely from deforestation, from animals, and from overusing fertilizers. And then we get into industry, we get into transport, buildings, and of course, everything else, including the kind of petroleum industry, natural gas industries, secondary emissions on top of all that. So first and foremost, we have to work across all those sectors of the economy and find opportunities to be more efficient, use less and less wasteful practices, but then pivot what we do to low carbon alternatives, whether it's like solar and wind or nuclear, hydro, whatever, for electricity, but similarly for food. How do we grow food without deforestation, without belching methane from cattle and so on, without overusing fertilizers? And the good news is, in many of these areas, there are solutions, and the solutions are often very good for us. They can produce new jobs, they can produce new kind of economic opportunities. Done right, they can also reduce tensions around the world, maybe even increase justice and equity across the world, do things that we should be doing in the 21st century anyway. Too much of our world is built in the 19th century on 19th century ideas, and yet here we are in the 21st century, still using kind of bad old technologies that don't serve us all that well anymore. So that's the good news about climate change, and also for water. If we look for it, there are enormous opportunities to be far more efficient and to use new technologies and new ideas to really radically change our relationship to these resources so we can live good, full lives around the world, but without such a terrible footprint on the planet.
So certainly water is where we feel climate change in many, many aspects, and we'll get into some of those solutions you just mentioned in a short while. But of course, one area where we do see climate change very significantly, and also our human misbehaviors, is around the ocean. So Chris, you've been fighting ocean pollution for a long time. In 1990, you co-founded Surfers Against Sewage, which I'm interested to learn a little more about. But the idea behind that was to specifically raise awareness about the need to protect the ocean in order as well to protect human life. What's your resume, shall we say, 30 years down the line in terms of our relationship with the ocean? Has that awareness been expanded? Is it enough? What are your thoughts there?
I mean, if we rewind to that 1990, and I think picking up on what Jonathan was saying, that the oceans were regarded as a convenient dumping ground, and that was partly because we didn't use them. And if you don't use something, you don't value it, and if you don't value it, then you don't do anything to protect it. And in the UK back in 1990, we were discharging 400 million gallons of crude sewage every single day. So every single town, city, village was discharging completely crude sewage to sea with not even a basic screen in place. So literally imagine all the cities around the coast of the UK just discharging completely crude sewage to sea.
I prefer not to.
Absolutely, but two things there. From day one, we said that we wanted to see sewage, both liquid and the solid constituent parts of it, regarded as a resource rather than a waste. And if you start to do that, then you can, in some places, and I think there's a role for re-putting that water. So once you've cleaned up a sewage discharge to secondary level or tertiary level, you can put it back into water systems, because inevitably those water systems are drawing back out. I think the water in the Thames, by the time it gets to London, they think it's been through humans about 6 times. So it gets put back into a river and then abstracted further down. But we did use our coastal waters as a dumping ground. And unfortunately, in some places, that's still the situation. But I think our relationship with the oceans is changing. I think it is better than it was. I don't think anybody would consider that an appropriate technology to be doing now. We are more aware. I think programs like David Attenborough, The Blue Planet, really raised up that whole issue of ocean plastics. And ocean plastics, again, they're visible. And I think it's the visual, actual thing that you can go down and you can see the pollution, and it's affecting people while they're having holidays. But I think as well, people are now starting to understand that those little bits of microplastics are appearing even in the guts of fishes. And therefore, those things are quite shocking to people. And there's the campaigning side of it, but underneath it, you always need the science and the expertise to kind of help drive those messages forward so that people grasp it and understand that they do have this relationship with the oceans. And the oceans are, without healthy oceans, the climate change will get a lot worse. And it'll be, interestingly, it's one of the great kind of fighting areas between conflict between the natural environment and humans is on that coastal kind of hub. And we've seen it increase storm activity. We've had 3 storms that have had names. That's when there were a serious one within the UK in the last week. We've seen, and all of those again will be driving overloads of our sewage systems. So we're then seeing more pollution go in because our storm activities, the intensity of storms, are causing lots of rain to come down really quickly, overflow the system, and then we can't even store that. So we miss out on some of that water, and some of that water doesn't go back in to regenerate the kind of groundwater and the aquifers that Jonathan was talking about earlier, because we're getting massive downpours rather than slow soakings where the water is absorbed into the ground. So it's multifaceted, but I'd like to think that we're better than we were in terms of our relationship with the oceans.
So let's talk about solutions. So in particular, when it comes to awareness, fantastic, but what can people do? What can individuals do? What can communities do to protect water resources?
Well, I think the first is to understand how important water is. And I almost thought maybe everybody should have a tattoo on their arm that says, you are 60% water. Because we would die. It's the first thing. If you take away our water, we die. And it's the same with our the whole living world around us really requires that water. But what can actually people do in their own homes? Look for low consumption. Put your wash on a low level of a water conserving cycle in the washing machine, but fit low flow showers and all those kind of things. We don't really need to have a shower or 2 showers every single day, but we've kind of been conned into this version of consumerism. But also, and I think again, Jonathan touched on it, the supply chain of everything that we consume has a take on water, and understanding your water footprint as well as your carbon footprint would be an excellent first step. I think if everybody should, do those 2 things, understand your carbon footprint and your water footprint, and then discuss it and communicate it and make that a normal discussion.
Fantastic. Well, we've seen some corporations already moving in that direction. There's also talk of water labeling, also for household appliances, etc. So let's hope those steps are going to be made fairly soon. Jonathan, if I can come back to you, you mentioned before that 70% of water is used in irrigation. So it's all intrinsically linked to our food security, and having a secure water supply is very important for that. But not only does the way that we produce food today add stress to water availability, but we also have a growing population wanting more food, putting more demands on water resources. So this can be, in some cases, a hotbed of contention, if you like, a perfect storm, I assume. How can we build a more sustainable food system that at the same time safeguards these water resources and helps some equality in terms of access to water?
Yeah, well, as you point out, this link between the need to produce more food in the world as the world gets richer and more numerous is a well-known kind of thought. I'll go back and challenge that in a second, though. And then the idea that water and food are intrinsically linked. Water is used primarily to grow food on this planet. Again, 70% of the withdrawals, 85% of what's used and not returned is for irrigation, at least globally. It varies a lot around the world. And so you wonder, do we have enough water to grow a growing food supply for a growing world? It's a very reasonable question. Another thing that we have to think about is agriculture is also a problem for water, not only in consuming it, but also polluting it. Much of the fertilizers used in the world, especially the nitrogen and phosphorus in the fertilizers we have, are causing widespread kind of toxic algae blooms, if you will, in lakes and streams and rivers around the world, but even coastal oceans. The outflow of nitrate pollution from over-fertilized breadbaskets of the world are actually killing off ocean life and causing what are called hypoxic zones or dead zones in the ocean. Nearly every major river in the world has a dead zone off the coast because we're pouring fertilizer into the ocean, essentially choking it with weeds, and those weeds die, rot, and consume the water out of the oxygen out of the water column. So this is a really big problem. So the water and agriculture are linked in both directions. The solutions are abundant, though, because the food system is actually really, really bad. To food waste, first and foremost, 40% of the entire world's food supply. The world's, not just one country, the world's food supply is never eaten. So think about that. That means right off the top, 40% of all the resources used to grow food around the world was never actually needed. Why aren't we tackling that problem first? That's a huge opportunity space. Second, of course, is what we eat, even if we don't waste it. There are a lot of countries in the world that are eating, according to our doctors anyway, too much red meat and dairy products, which are enormously consumptive of land, water, greenhouse gases, and so on, much more than plant-based diets, or even things like chicken and other animal proteins. So we could certainly do better there too. Not everybody's going to do that, nor everyone should, but there are some places to find opportunities there as well. And then third, there are a lot of kind of 80-20 rules in how much resources we use to get like a calorie of food. I like to look at the food system and say, how many good meals do we produce divided by how much resource did it take to grow that? And there are some places in the world that are using an enormous amount of water. So you have kind of flood irrigation, you have drip irrigation, and everything in between. Enormous technological opportunities to be more efficient with water. Like drip irrigation is so much better than flood irrigation or center pivot, which we use in places like the US. So again, technology, getting smarter, being more efficient, wasting less, and so on. These are huge opportunities, like factors of 10 to 100 in irrigation alone, and then 40% off the top from food waste, as well as changing diets. So I look at this problem and say, wow, the solutions are abundant because we're kind of in a really broken food system that's wasting a lot of food, water, and other resources. Let's get smarter about it.
Now, Chris, we heard about some more systemic changes that could be made. Perhaps it's sometimes difficult to relate that to a particular individual human being, and you talked about the water footprint. I had the honor of being influenced in the 90s probably now by Professor John Allen, who you may know, who coined the term virtual water. He was also the person who said, you know, if you want to do more for water resources in the world, become a vegetarian. So getting back to Jonathan's point about dietary choice. But anyway, virtual water, basically, you know, how much water is contained in all of the things which we consume. Also getting back not only to food, but textiles, for example, how much do you need for a pair of jeans, etc. So that's perhaps one important concept on the water footprint side of things for one human being to think about what they're doing. At the same time as well, the United Nations in 2010 recognized water as a basic human right. So that could be counterintuitive in terms of, okay, I need to look after this precious resource. On the other side, well, it's my right. I can do with it what I want to do, perhaps. How can we get people to fix that in their heads? How can they value water on the one side and also treat it as a basic human right on the other side?
I think I'd go to the point there where you said, I can do with it what I like. And the reality is that that kind of mentality was okay maybe when there were sub a million, a billion of us. But we can't have that attitude, because everything we do, we have a responsibility to the planet, but also to each other. So what we do, if I do something bad and I go, well, I don't care, I can treat my water this way, that impacts on someone or something somewhere. So that ability to go in and say, I want 3 t-shirts for, £10 or $10, that has a cost somewhere along the line. And that probably is water. It'll be involved in there. We also start to see, again, people's desire to drink bottled water or, fizzy drinks and those kind of things, the consumption of water into those. And then people are quite happy to pay, a large price for water. But we also used to run, again, on World Water Day with people like WaterAid. We used to get people to carry the water. And I think we just flick a tap on, and therefore we have no understanding of the value. I was lucky enough to go on a trip to Kenya at one point with the Eden Project, and they got us up one morning and they said, right, we're going to go out to get your cameras ready. We're going to go to a watering hole. And we went to this watering hole, and everybody was ready to go and see the lovely animals coming down to it. They were exclusively humans, and they were exclusively girls, and they were exclusively under the age of puberty. And their job every day was to get up and walk several kilometers, scramble down this steep slope, and then put the water on their shoulders, and then walk all the way back up the slope and back to their village. And I carried one of those bits of water, and it nearly did me in the heat. One of our members of the team broke their leg. And on the inspiration of that, every year at the Eden Project, we would do on World Water Day, we would allow and encourage members of the public to carry that water, to understand quite how precious it is. So that's one thing I think that we can do. And again, you use the word honor and respect, and I think we have to do that. I'm lucky enough to have grown up connected with the natural environment, with the sea, and with moorland and things like that. And if I love something, I will protect it. And that's a fundamental message I think that people have to understand, is that connection, and quite how lucky we are, especially, I've got a roof over my head, I'll be warm and safe and secure tonight. Millions of people aren't. And those are where some of the big stresses come in. So it's that personal responsibility, but also understanding the wider societal responsibility and our position in making those problems come forward. And again, just picking up on this thing of diet, if you keep eating red meat and a lot of dairy, that's not good for you. You need a balance. You need to eat more vegetables. You look at the overload on our health system, etc. And a lot of that will be because of people's diets. Everybody will be healthier and happier if we switch to a more vegetable base.
And you're helping the planet and water reserves at the same time.
Absolutely.
To Jonathan's point, absolutely. Jonathan, another paradox I'd like to explore with you is technology. A lot of great technologies exist for desalination, atmospheric water generation, to harvest water in the air. And countries are deploying these technologies to become more resilient to water scarcity. Desalination capacity alone has more than doubled in the last decade, and projections show it's going to increase at the same trajectory. But these are very energy intensive technologies, so it of course can contribute further to the climate problems which we have. So how can we balance the application of such technologies with their footprint? How can we move towards sustainability?
Yeah, well, first we have to recognize things like desalination and atmospheric water capture and things like this, are enormously energy intensive, and they result in very, very small amounts of water. There's no way that desalination is going to ever kind of replace the natural flows of water that we experience and use today. Not even close, not by a factor of 1,000,000. They will help on the margins for maybe water use in cities and where potable water is absolutely critical during stressed out times of drought. So, on the edge, on the margin, maybe, and usually in very rich places. And I could see this working well in the Middle East. Yes. I could see this working well in island nations. Yes. The rest of the world, not even close. So I think we have to think about other kinds of technologies.
Is that because of the energy required for it, or what is the reason for that?
Well, just sheer engineering of what we're talking about. The water supply used in agriculture is measured in cubic kilometers of water, thousands of them. There's no human engineering feat in the world other than a dam that can come close to even holding that much water, let alone generating it from the sea and using reverse osmosis or whatever, or capturing it from the atmosphere. Nature is a hell of a lot better engineer than we are. Why don't we let nature give us the water and just be better stewards of it? So I would like to see more technology used in like water recycling of water again and again and again, like we just heard about with sewage. We're going to have to get good at that, really good at that, but also efficiency in water use in agriculture. Again, a factor of 100 difference from one part of the world to the other about how many liters of water it takes to make one food calorie between, let's say, some parts of Rajasthan and Israel, for example. Wow, that's a great opportunity. We can get 100 times the food for the same amount of water, or 1/100th of water for the same amount of food. I mean, that's a pretty good deal. Same thing with domestic use, industrial use, and so on. So I wish the same kind of technological zeal that we see in let's produce more water be put into how do we use the water we have much more efficiently, given that it's orders and orders of magnitude larger, and it's also going to be cheaper and probably more ubiquitous around the world if we do it right. So, I don't mind the idea of desalination. It will be a marginal good thing in a few places, but it's not the solution. So, why do we put our technology and our technological might and muscle to where the problem really is, which is, let's work with nature, be more efficient with what we've got. And there are huge opportunities to do that. And they're cheap, they're abundant, they're everywhere, they work, and they often have co-benefits to other things we care about too. And so I think there are things here we need to think about. Again, not to smash the high-tech ideas, but we tend to lean on these high-tech solutions rather than kind of thinking a little bit more like, how could we be more efficient and more kind of mindful of the resources that are abundant around us right now? And we can do both. I think the world's big enough for both, but let's make sure we think about efficiency first.
All starting with the value of water, which we've been talking about.
Exactly.
Now, Chris, we've managed so far not to mention this, the P word, the pandemic, but I've got to ask, because we've seen quite a radical change in people's behaviors, of course, in the past 18 months or so. How has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted water pollution? What have you observed?
I mean, there has been an increase in the number of single-use masks on beaches and things, and depending on where you are and what in the world and what their waste management collection systems and are like, that will affect the number of those. I guess everybody's been washing their hands a whole lot more, so there's been more water going through the system. I don't know that it's had a major impact. Probably one of the biggest impacts it had was a reduction in the carbon used to fly around the world. So that was probably one of the benefits. And there's a slight hope, I guess, that we've all learned how to do this, and talk online, and those systems have come forwards that allow us to communicate. And then again, when we do travel, to really, really value that travel. So I don't think it's been a hugely negative one, but there will have been some impacts. I don't know whether Jonathan,
have a respite? Have they had a bit of a breather, a bit of a break from some of the polluting habits which we normally exhibit?
In terms of littering, I would say yes, but in terms of the flow of sewage and again, the toxics and the discharges of chemical fertilizers and pesticides and pollutants, I think they've all been going on the same, I would say, because we've been still eating and consuming the same.
Jonathan, any observations?
I'd be interested, Jonathan. Jonathan, have you got
observations from your side on what have we changed in the past 18 months? Have we become wiser?
Oh God, I wish we could say that. Maybe. You would think if anything could bring humanity together and make us reflect on our future and our stewardship of this world and of our civilization, it would be a global pandemic. We're literally in this all together. And national boundaries don't matter to viruses, and this is affecting young and old, rich and poor, urban and rural. Everyone is being affected by this terrible, terrible pandemic. And we, I would hope would step back and kind of examine our lives with the larger systems level of like, why do we have pandemics like this? Maybe we should look at our food system and relationship to nature and other things, but also just kind of looking at the trade-off of materialism versus well-lived lives of connection and wisdom. And the opportunity for us to live incredible lives in this century is just right in front of us. We are living now overall and will live in the future, I believe, the best lives humanity's ever seen. And yet we're squandering a lot of those possibilities. We're not getting them to everyone. We're not doing it fairly. We're not doing it as well or kind of judiciously as we could for the next generations. And so the question is, will we be good ancestors to those in the future? Will we be the same kinds of people who in our past sacrificed a little, thought a little, worked a little to make sure we could live better lives? I want to make sure we're doing that too. And I'm not sure that we are, but I know that we can be. And that ultimately is what we have, is a choice to make. What kind of people do we want to be? How do we want to be remembered in future centuries? How do we want to be remembered by our children? And that's a choice we can still make. And we have an incredible opportunity ahead of us if we decide to seize it and make a better world for everyone. And the good news is it's entirely possible. The bad news is we have to make a choice. It's a little different than maybe the choice we've been following so far.
Well, you picked out one of my favorite phrases, the good ancestor, and I actually have a fantastic book here, which you probably all know from Roman Kusnarik from Oxford. Yeah, it's a fascinating way of thinking. Do you think that's shifted a little bit in the last 18 months, finally, Jonathan?
In some ways, yes. I think the world has become more aware of our common vulnerabilities to things like pandemics, to economic disruptions, to climate change, to other things. I think there's a growing awareness of the kind of magnitude of the problems we're facing. Yet, at least in my country, and I think in a lot of the others who will be watching this, we're seeing kind of an increase in polarization and kind of meanness. So I worry about that tendency for us to not be coming together precisely at the time we need to. And I don't know, it's, what Dickens said, the best of times and the worst of times, that's probably always been the case in human history of competing tensions. And we have to build the world somewhere in the tension between the really great things that are happening at this moment in history and the really terrible things. So I want to nudge, and I think everyone listening would like to help nudge the world a little bit closer to the world that can be, that's better. And let's all take some steps to see what we can do to get there.
So, Chris, in a nutshell, if we follow on that thought, how will you describe the future of sustainability and how can we get there?
Again, I don't really want to add very much to what Jonathan said there, because I thought that was brilliantly said. It is to understand that we have more in common with each other. And also to understand that the systems that run this world and govern and regulate us, they are actually there for us, and we can change. And if everybody voted for a system with good values that took care of each other and the planet, I think that will help unlock all of this potential. And I veer between it being extremely challenging and cautiously optimistic. We have the intellect and the know-how and the experience to be able to do this. We have to just hunker down and do it.
To mobilize. Jonathan, what word would you give to try and mobilize people for a sustainable future?
Well, first, if you don't mind, I would like to not use the word sustainable so much. It's not very inspiring. If someone asked you, hey, how's your marriage? And you said, oh, it's sustainable. I'm like, oh God, I'm so sorry. Let's go have a pint, That's not very exciting. I'd like to have words like thrive and better and, equitable and kind and good and prosperous, all the things I think a lot of people in the world would like to have. Let's talk about a thriving world where people and nature can thrive together across generations into the future. I think when you show people a vision of a better world, not a bad world, but a better world, and invite people to join you in building it, that's when you kind of ignite people's passions, their souls, their energy, their hearts. And Martin Luther King in America in the civil rights movement, he didn't go around the country saying, I have a nightmare. He talked about a dream he had about a better world where we could live better. We're nowhere near finishing that dream, of course, but it's there. I think we need to do the same thing when it comes to the environment and sustainability. Let's stop talking about the nightmares so much. Maybe we need to be reminded of those. But let's talk about the dreams, the opportunities, the possibilities we have together, and invite all of us, even people we often disagree with, to say, hey, we could go build this better world. And guess what? We're going to need you too, and you and me and everyone else to be part of that. And wouldn't that be great? And I think people can be motivated by that, to a common dream of building a better world. And as divided as we are, or appear to be, at the bottom of, at our core, I should say, we all love our children. We all want a better world for them. We all want the future to be okay. I've never met anyone who doesn't want that. So let's find our commonalities and realize that that better world is just waiting for us to go build it. And stop listening to the people who tell us otherwise. Let's go do this and find common ground, because there's a lot of it out there. And let's go build a better future.
Gentlemen, on those positive words, we will conclude episode 11 of Voices of Sustainability. This has been our wonderful Waterside Chat, the transition to an inclusive and prosperous future. Today on World Water Day. Massive thanks to you, Chris. Massive thanks to you, Jonathan. And ladies and gentlemen, you can rewatch this in case you were out getting a glass of water or something on the prizes social media channels on YouTube. Gentlemen, thank you so much for those inspiring words. And yeah, let's look forward to an abundant and thriving water future.